With BlizzCon over, along with the Mauga playtest, there are a lot of things in store for the tanks in the game. The Roadhog rework is coming soon, but before that happens, let's look at the tier list of the tanks following the support nerfs that has actually had a pretty drastic impact on the top tanks, including an honorable mention of Mauga's power level after I personally played him for most of the weekend. Luckily, not everyone was forcing Mauga, so there were plenty of matches with unfavorable matchups into heroes like Doomfist, Queen, Zarya, and even some attempts at Roadhog. And speaking of Roadhog, funny enough, Mauga has made him just a bit worse to play into, so even with the rework coming soon, somehow another hero that can farm his massive feeding hitbox has arrived. If you're looking to grind to get better on tanks, use the link in the description to get access to a GameLeap membership, with guides for both mechanically intensive tanks like Doomfist and Junker Queen on top of macro courses on how to best play Winston strategically. There's a lot of options for whatever hero you're trying to learn, so check it out and enjoy the video. It is once again that I have to deliver the sad news that Roadhog is still very not good tier, and after playing against him over the weekend with Mauga, it's not looking good at all. So we all already know how bad Roadhog is, so let me focus not on how bad he is, but what he's missing. The only things Roadhog really has going for him are his hook and his close range damage. He's definitely a lot better at close range with his consistent shotgun damage, and even if his mid-range secondary fire is good against tanks, and even for one-shots on Tracer, way more tanks than ever before now beat him at that range. Roadhog is still present in high ranks, and is strangely enough, sometimes a nuisance, along with peel-heavy supports like Kiriko and Lifeweaver, but he simply doesn't get a lot of value besides being a big guy in the front line. His damage is low, he feeds every time he peeks, and hitting hooks often just means your target gets saved and you get ran on. Even though you can do a lot to survive as Roadhog and sustain on the point, it's difficult to actually do anything meaningful otherwise for your team that other heroes wouldn't do better, and still have other utility. Next up is Wrecking Ball in D tier, who's doing better and can even be a valuable substitute in some brawl matchups where he initiates for his team of heroes like Sojourn, Genji, and Lucio to push really hard and capitalize off his disruptive abilities. But he still is just so difficult to play effectively, since he really needs compositions with a good mix between spam and dive to be a better option than other heroes. He also gets wildly shut down by stronger heroes like D.Va and even Zarya outside of hard dive maps, making it really difficult to stay in the fight when you can always get bullied and pressured away. The tough thing for Wrecking Ball is to play aggressively and get successful engages while dealing with the fact that anybody who completely chases you around will get value for locking the enemy tank completely out of the fight. It's not always the best choice for the hero chasing Ball, but it's annoyingly viable and can really ruin the ball gaming experience. We'll have to see what changes he'll get next, since it seems like no matter how much he has been adjusted to Overwatch 2, he's never really seen consistent play, even on dive maps where he can really threaten the objective and play around duels better than most heroes in the game. Next up in C tier is our funny honorable mention hero, Mauga. He's obviously not in the game yet, but with the state we saw him in over the BlizzCon free trial weekend, there's a lot to say about how good he is in the current climate. Starting off with the good news, Mauga has a healthy amount of strong abilities, with a CC immunity and mobility wrapped up in one cooldown, incredibly strong close range kill pressure, and very consistent long range damage, and his ultimate is uniquely strong for getting free kills on otherwise very mobile and sustainable targets. His cardiac overdrive is also incredibly strong, but you're just not going to see its maximum value outside of high level play just yet, since it requires a lot of timing to get value outside of just keeping Mauga himself alive. He definitely seems like a good hero, and though I honestly think getting anti-nated isn't a big problem for him since he is totally fine playing outside of close range, his massive hitbox and inconsistent damage mitigation makes him impossible against certain matchups. Mauga's problem is literally that he needs to play against massive tanks to get his overhealth and healing, since he can only consistently get his overhealth churning from his passive and blasting a large target at close range with both guns, giving him critical damage for every secondary fire shot. He is otherwise just a massive target, and with his movement ability also tied to his CC immunity, it's hard to engage someone with stuns or boops, like half the tank roster and a lot of good supports. He definitely melts Wrecking Ball and Roadhog, and even some of the high ranked tanks above him, and he actually has a pretty good matchup into Bastion, but for now, damage and support heroes have a really easy time to him, making him way more difficult to play. But anyway, he's not playable until the start of Season 8, but it's still fun to take a look at how good he can potentially be when he does eventually drop later on. Moving on to the current members of C tier, Zarya is our first, who is still suffering from her bubble nerfs. We're still past the horrible tiers of tank heroes, and Zarya is still super strong when combined with heroes like Bastion and Genji, to then transform that support into a lot of damage that can really threaten the current meta frontlines. Zarya being a high damage output machine does a lot into top tier heroes like, again, Bastion, but also the recently strong Sigma, who can't sustain Zarya's damage after his shield is broken. But Zarya still really struggles to support herself in the frontline, often having to sit back to avoid getting run over and punished, and the support she gives to her allies is sometimes not enough to help them get advantages over the backline. Despite the support nerfs, if the healers are pocketing each other, it's almost impossible to get a kill on them, and a bubble does nothing much to help that cause. A high energy Zarya with 2 bubbles is still a force to be reckoned with, but when you have to wait for so long to achieve that state, you might have already lost all the time and space to win the important fights. Finishing off C tier is Winston, who's still struggling to deal with the insane damage in the game right now. Bastion is obviously the biggest culprit, and although he's gotten a lot weaker, he's still really easy to keep alive, even without his turret form to reduce his damage taken. The secondary fire buff is actually surprisingly useful, but it's not exactly allowing him to do something that he couldn't do before. Poking only before engaging will never net you the kill, but it's great for setting someone up for the jump or straight up just building ultimate charge as fast as you can. His one new problem that's still messing him up, even in games where there's no heavy damage to melt out the Winston is that Doomfist and D.Va are more favorable divers that can handle more matchups than he can, and Primal Rage right now is really impossible to even confirm just one kill. It's been worse for him before, and he still has some really good highs, but with Summer being a bit iffy, there just isn't that confirmed dive kill that a more spam-based dive composition can also do, but not have to be completely reliant on engaging hard to win. Now to move up to B tier, and Ramatra has lost a bit of his high. He's tragically the one tank that is very bad into Zenyatta now, having a much harder time killing Zenyatta in the duel and also suffering from his Discord that only really works against tanks that can't break line of sight often and need to lead the charge in the front line. He still got his power, being able to just push through and go hard with his pummeling punches, and he can be especially good on maps like New Queen Street where he's an easier time controlling the corners and chokes with his slowing vortex. The Nemesis form cooldown change has definitely made him a lot more comfortable to play, and he also finally lives up closer to the name of the tempo tank that can literally, like all other tanks, control tempo. With his Nemesis form more available and also less punishing to use with his short cooldown to recover later with, he's a solid pick that can really be a hard carry when positioned on the backline and key targets successfully. Next in B tier is Reinhardt, who really only suffers to map picks, and when on his strong maps can be the biggest slog to deal with, even when considering heroes like Orisa when it comes to holding space and buying time. And despite not doing a lot of damage when playing against unfavorable matchups, he still gets Earth Shatter enough to help the team out in the ultimate trade, and it's remarkably strong even against durable teams with a lot of defensive abilities because it can hit an entire team. And he definitely gets points for being one of the best heroes to play strategically with. If everyone's communicating, you can use rank comps to really wipe the floor with everyone. He may struggle every now and then, but he definitely has the potential, even though he's a more counterable hero than most. For the top of B tier and maybe a bit underrated is D.Va, who's got insane potential rising with how much he can push her abilities to the limit, but often those limits aren't strong enough or take too much effort to get her going. D.Va is mostly a gatekeeper for the higher ranks, and for top players a solo carry super diver, so she's usually either marking a Wrecking Ball or Winston or gunning down backline for picks. It's not a bad spot to be, and she's still better at getting confirmed kills and pressure than Ball or Winston, no matter which team comp you're against, but she does struggle to get past the top 2 or 3 tanks who have a good matchup into her on top of doing their own job. Finally, moving into A tier, Orisa is slowly taking her time leaving out the main door, but she's still lingering, being a very solid pick for just taking no nonsense space in the front line and just stacking cooldowns and being a nuisance. She's lost her frontline spam advantage to Sigma, and she's more of a bully now, but similarly to D.Va, she can only really punch down to worse tanks, and there are a lot of options to counter both her directly and to ignore her and pressure her team. Given that Orisa doesn't really have any peel options for her team besides body blocking for them, either normally or with the javelin spin, it's a valid option. She still gets a gold star for survivability and damage, but her utility side is starting to feel a bit stale. Unless you hit every javelin and are consistently getting picks by going aggressive, which isn't possible into most compositions, you're better off playing slower with a different hero altogether. And one of those different heroes could be the top of A tier, Junker Queen, who is still spamming bleed healing every time she peeks. Junker Queen has a perfect package, a small hitbox, heavy close to mid-range damage, and a spearhead ability to push your team forward. She can bully other tanks easily with her Carnage and Blade, and has so much survivability that commanding shout is super hard to force out, making it easy for Queen players to choose their own engages no matter what. Rampage has gotten a lot better, but is definitely one of the weaker spots in her kit, as the top 2 tanks in S tier above have way better ultimates by comparison. And the first one of these goes to Sigma, who's finally being recognized as a bit of the perfect all-rounder tank. With a lot of players getting better at the hero, he's more generally able to hold space, when before he usually would get run over or outpaced. His ultimate is one of the strongest in the game, forcing multiple cooldowns and often multi-kills. He has always been a solid hero, but it's really his ability to handle Bastion and the other increasingly powerful damage spam sources in the game that makes him so necessary. Hopefully he doesn't receive any nerfs, it's better for the game to get into a more dive-friendly direction. And although Malgo being a brawl-based tank isn't awesome for the feature of more mobile tanks to even out the roster, the one tank left at best Sigma is Doomfist, who's also seeing great bolstered playtime for his ability to handle the stronger damage and support heroes in the game. Doom gains the advantage over Sigma thanks to the support nerfs, making them more susceptible to getting isolated by dive heroes with no abilities. Sigma doesn't get as much of the value as the support nerfs since he's a ranged hero who has to approach them from the front anyway, whereas Doomfist and his dive DPS can skip that step and go straight to the backline. Even the fact that he's been nerfed shows signs that he's been more favorable, and across most of the higher ranks. His short cooldown rocket punch gives him a lot of leeway in the tank brawl, and also can cancel a lot of engages, disrupting the flow of the enemy. And as for damage presence, he wins a lot of engagements based off of just big hitboxes, making him play as a sort of a third DPS when it comes down to focus fire. That's it for the tank tier list for mid-season 7, but stay tuned to the channel next week as we see the effects of the Hog rework along with some other tuning changes to unknown heroes in the next patch. If you're looking to grind to get better on tanks, use the link in the description to get access to a GameLeap membership, with guides for both mechanically intensive tanks like Doomfist and Junker Queen on top of macro courses on how to best play Winston strategically. There's a lot of options for whatever hero you're trying to learn,